Everett Morgan stared at the newborn in his trembling hands, the child's first cry piercing the silence of his isolated cabin while the mother lay unconscious in his bed. As the infant's features came into focus through his tears, a devastating realization struck him. The baby bore an unmistakable resemblance to the daughter he'd lost 5 years ago. The wind howled like a wounded beast, clawing at the walls of Everett Morgan's cabin with icy fingers. 3 days the blizzard had raged now, burying the mountain in a shroud of white so thick a man could get lost between his door and the woodpile. Not that Everett minded much. Solitude was why he'd come to these remote Montana mountains 5 winters ago, fleeing memories as deep as the snow outside. He stoked the fire, watching embers spiral upward as pine logs crackled and split. The flames cast dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls of the one-room cabin. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, remedies gathered during summer months when the mountains burst with life. A single window, now frosted with intricate ice patterns, offered the only glimpse of the raging storm outside. Everett was a trapper by trade, though hunting had been sparse lately. His snares had yielded little before the storm descended, and now they lay buried somewhere beneath feet of snow. He'd need to venture out once the blizzard passed, but for now, his stores would hold. Dried meat hung in strips near the ceiling, and sacks of beans and flour rested against the wall. He was prepared for isolation, welcomed it even. Sleep came fitfully that night, his dreams haunted by fragments of the past. He dreamed of hospital corridors, of monitors beeping in rhythmic counterpoint to his wife Sarah's labored breathing, of the moment her hand went slack in his. He woke with a start, heart pounding, the phantom scent of antiseptic burning his nostrils. Even after 5 years, the memories remained razor sharp. Morning arrived with no respite from the storm. Everett moved through his routine mechanically, stoking the fire, melting snow for washing, chewing on jerky while sipping bitter coffee. By midday, he'd whittled 3 new wooden figures to add to the collection lining his shelves. Little woodland creatures, bears, foxes, rabbits, crafted with surprising delicacy by his calloused hands. Once, they'd been intended for a nursery that would never be used. The sound came just as evening approached, so faint he almost missed it beneath the storm's wail. A cry, no, something else, a desperate pounding, followed by what could only be a human voice. Everett froze, knife poised above the half-carved owl in his hands. Nobody ventured this high in winter, nobody sane anyway. The pounding came again, more urgent this time. Setting aside his carving, Everett grabbed his rifle from beside the door. Not that he expected trouble, but 5 years alone had taught him caution. He unlatched the heavy wooden door, bracing against the howling wind that immediately rushed in, carrying swirling snow and bitter cold. At first, he saw nothing but white, then a dark shape collapsed forward across his threshold, a person covered in snow, trembling violently. Everett dropped his rifle, grabbing the figure before they could fall completely. Only when he dragged them inside and kicked the door shut did he get a proper look. A woman, young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair matted to her pale face. Her clothes, wholly inadequate for mountain winter, were soaked through, and her lips had taken on a dangerous bluish tinge. But most alarming was the unmistakable swell of her belly beneath her coat. She was pregnant, very pregnant. Jesus Christ, Everett muttered, lifting her toward the fire. Miss, can you hear me? Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of amber. Please, she whispered through chattering teeth. Help us. Us. The word struck him like a physical blow. Survival instinct took over. He stripped away her wet clothes, wrapping her in every blanket he possessed. He positioned her near the fire, close enough for warmth, but not so near as to shock her system. He'd seen frostbite before, knew the dangers of warming too quickly. Her fingers and toes were red and swollen, but thankfully not the waxy white of severe cold injury. What's your name? He asked, pressing a cup of warmed broth to her lip. Eliza, she managed between sips. Eliza Walsh. How'd you end up out there, Eliza? He tried to keep his voice gentle, though panic churned in his gut. A pregnant woman, in his cabin, miles from the nearest doctor or town, in the middle of the worst blizzard he'd seen in years. Car broke down. 5 miles back, tried to... Her voice faded as her eyes fluttered closed. Everett checked her pulse. Rapid, but steady. Exhaustion had claimed her, which was probably for the best. He tucked the blankets more securely around her and added another log to the fire. She slept through the night and most of the following day, stirring occasionally with soft murmurs that Everett couldn't make out. He kept vigil, alternating between checking her temperature and peering anxiously out the window. The storm showed no signs of relenting, which meant no chance of getting her down the mountain to medical help. When she finally woke properly, the sun had already begun its early winter descent. She struggled to sit up, one hand instinctively cradling her belly. "Easy," Everett cautioned, helping her to lean against the wall. "You're safe, but you need to move slow." Recognition dawned in her eyes as she took in her surroundings, the cabin, the fire, the stranger who'd rescued her. "Well, how long was I out?" "About 18 hours, he replied, handing her a cup of water. "Storm still going strong. No way to get down the mountain yet." She nodded, sipping carefully. The color had returned to her face, though dark circles remained beneath her eyes. "Thank you for taking me in." Everett shrugged uncomfortably. Gratitude always made him uneasy, or couldn't exactly leave you out there. Some might have. Her gaze was direct, assessing, "You live up here alone. 5 years now. A long time to spend by yourself." He didn't respond to that, busying himself instead with preparing a simple stew. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling fire and the relentless howl of the wind. "I need to tell you something," she finally said, her voice tight with anxiety. This baby, it could come any day now." Everett nearly dropped the wooden spoon he was holding. "How soon?" "I'm due in a week, but with everything that happened yesterday..." She trailed off, leaving the implication hanging. Cold dread settled in Everett's stomach. He'd never delivered a baby, hadn't even been present for. He shut down that thought before it could fully form. "When the storm breaks, I'll get you to town," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Eliza's smile was small and didn't reach her eyes. "We both know this storm isn't breaking anytime soon." She paused, one hand making small circles over her belly. "Can I ask why you're up here, all alone?" The question was innocent enough, but it probed at wounds still raw despite the years. Everett turned back to the stew, stirring with unnecessary vigor. "Needed the quiet," he said finally. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." She seemed to sense his reluctance and didn't press further. Instead, she asked if she could help with anything. He set her to cutting dried apples while he finished the stew, and they worked in surprisingly comfortable silence. Over dinner, she told him pieces of her story. She'd been heading to Bozeman to stay with her sister after leaving what she only described as a bad situation back east. The baby's father wasn't in the picture. She'd thought she could make the drive before the storm hit, but the mountain roads had proved more treacherous than anticipated. "Stupid," she said, shaking her head. "I should have waited in the last town." "We all make choices we think are right at the time," Everett replied, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. That night, he gave her his bed, fashioning a makeshift pallet for himself near the fire. As he lay listening to the storm and her soft breathing, a strange feeling settled over him. His life, so carefully constructed around solitude, had been irrevocably disrupted, and somehow he couldn't bring himself to mind. Dawn brought more snow and a troubling development. Eliza woke with pain gripping her lower back, radiating around to her abdomen. Everett recognized the signs even before she spoke the words. "The baby's coming," she whispered, fear and determination warring in her eyes. "I think it's starting." Everett Morgan, who had fled to the mountains to escape the ghosts of his past, now found himself facing the very thing that had broken him. A woman in labor, a child fighting to enter the world, and nowhere to run. Panic surged through Everett's veins, cold and electric. His hands shook as he poured water into his largest pot and set it over the fire to boil. What did he know about childbirth? Next to nothing. Sarah had never made it that far. The pregnancy lost at 5 months, and Sarah herself slipping away days later from complications the doctors couldn't reverse. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, kneeling beside the bed where Eliza now sat upright, her face contorted with discomfort. "That makes two of us," she replied, attempting a smile that quickly transformed into a grimace. "But women have been having babies since the beginning of time. We'll figure it out." Her confidence, however forced, steadied him slightly. "Tell me what you need." "Clean cloths, water, something to cut and tie the cord." She paused, breathing deeply through another wave of pain. "And maybe your hand to hold, if you don't mind." Everett gathered everything he could think might be useful. All his clean linens, his sharpest knife sterilized in boiling water, strips of cloth torn from an old shirt. He'd helped birth calves and foals in his younger days on his family's farm. This couldn't be entirely different, could it? The thought rang hollow, even as it formed. Hours passed in a blur of waiting, punctuated by increasingly frequent contractions. Outside, the blizzard continued its relentless assault, as if nature itself were conspiring to isolate them in this moment. Eliza paced when she could, rested when she couldn't, her face growing more strained as labor progressed. "Tell me about your life before," she said during a brief respite between contractions, clearly seeking distraction. Before the mountain, Everett, who had spent years avoiding this very conversation, found himself answering, "I was a carpenter, had a small business renovating old houses in Portland. My wife Sarah helped with the design work." "You're married," surprise colored her voice. The word felt like gravel in his throat. "She died 5 years ago." Understanding dawned in Eliza's eyes. "That's why you're here." It wasn't a question, but he nodded anyway. "We were going to have a baby too. A little girl. There were complications. We'd lost them both." The admission hung in the air between them, heavier than all the snow piling up outside. Eliza reached for his hand, squeezing with surprising strength. "I'm so sorry, Everett." Before he could respond, another contraction seized her, more intense than the previous ones. She cried out, doubling over, her fingernails digging into his palm. "They're getting closer," she gasped when it passed. "And stronger." Everett helped her back to the bed, positioning the clean cloths beneath her. "What else can I do?" "Just stay with me," she whispered. "Don't leave me alone." As night descended, Eliza's labor intensified. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the chill that crept into the cabin's corners. Everett kept the fire blazing, boiled more water, and held her hand through each contraction, feeling utterly helpless in the face of her pain. "Talk to me," she pleaded during a particularly difficult stretch. "Anything, just need to hear a voice." So he talked. He told her about growing up on his family's farm in eastern Oregon, about the time he fell from the hayloft and broke his arm in 2 places, about the old mare who followed him around like a dog. He described the first house he'd renovated, a Victorian disaster that had ultimately won a preservation award. He even told her about meeting Sarah at a friend's wedding, how he'd spilled red wine on her white dress and she'd laughed instead of getting angry. The stories poured out of him. Words he hadn't spoken aloud in years, memories he'd locked away as securely as his cabin door during storms. Somehow, in this strangest of circumstances, they didn't hurt quite as much to revisit. Around midnight, Eliza's labor reached its peak. She gripped his arms with bruising force, her face contorted in a mask of determination and agony. I need to push," she panted. I can feel it." Everett positioned himself at the foot of the bed, swallowing hard against the fear threatening to choke him. "I'm right here, you can do this." What followed tested them both to their limits. Eliza pushed with primal strength, her cries echoing against the cabin wall. Everett murmured encouragement, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. When he finally caught a glimpse of the baby's head, dark hair matted against impossibly delicate skin, something cracked open inside him, terror and wonder in equal measure. "I can see the head," he told her, voice rough with emotion. "You're doing it, Eliza. Keep going." 3 more pushes, and suddenly the baby slid into his waiting hands, tiny, slippery, and perfect. For one heart-stopping moment, there was silence. Then a lusty cry filled the cabin, more powerful than even the storm outside. "It's a boy," Everett said, his vision blurring with unexpected tears. "A beautiful boy." He placed the infant on Eliza's chest, where she cradled him with trembling arms. "Hello, little one." she whispered. "You picked quite the entrance." Everett cut and tied the cord as Eliza had instructed earlier, then covered them both with clean blankets. The afterbirth delivered without complications, and Everett disposed of the soiled cloths, marveling at how smoothly it had all gone. All things considered, a miracle really, out here in the wilderness with no medical help. When he returned to the bedside, Eliza was studying her son's face with exhausted wonder. "Look at him," she murmured. 10 perfect fingers, 10 perfect toes. Everett found himself unable to look away from the tiny life they'd ushered into the world. The baby had a shock of dark hair, a button nose, and, when he briefly opened them, eyes of deepest blue. "Have you thought of a name?" he asked, gently touching one miniature finger that immediately curled around his own. Eliza smiled. "I was thinking Thomas, after my grandfather." "Thomas," Everett repeated. "It suits him." She looked up then, her face serious despite her exhaustion. "I don't know how to thank you. We would have died out there." "No need for thanks," he replied, surprised to find he meant it. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said firmly. "Not anyone. You didn't just save us, Everett. You stayed, you helped. That matters." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The truth was, for the first time in 5 years, he felt present in his own life, not just surviving, but participating. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. As Eliza and baby Thomas drifted to sleep, Everett kept watch, tending the fire and listening to the storm gradually weakening outside. Dawn would bring decisions and complications. They would need to get down the mountain soon, find proper medical care for mother and child. But for now, in the warm glow of his cabin, something long dormant stirred in Everett's chest. He studied the sleeping infant's face, looking for resemblance to his mother, the shape of the brow, perhaps, and definitely the determined set of the tiny chin. But there was something else there too, something strangely familiar that he couldn't quite place. He dismissed the thought. All newborns looked somewhat alike, didn't they? Little did he know that the greatest shock was yet to come, a revelation that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his isolated existence and the past he'd tried so desperately to escape. Outside, the blizzard finally began to abate, stars appearing in patches between racing clouds. Nature had done its part, bringing these souls together. Now fate would reveal why. Morning arrived with startling brightness, sunlight reflecting off pristine snow in blinding intensity. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a transformed landscape, drifts taller than a man in some places, trees bowed under white weight, and a silence so complete it seemed to absorb all sound. Everett stood at the window, coffee cup warming his hand. Behind him, Eliza slept with baby Thomas nestled against her chest, both exhausted from the night's ordeal. He would need to venture out soon, assess the damage, see if there was any chance of clearing a path down the mountain. But for now, he allowed himself this moment of quiet reflection. 5 years of solitude, of carefully constructed isolation, undone in less than 48 hours. The cabin that had been his refuge now felt different, warmer somehow, despite the biting cold outside. The presence of other heartbeats had changed something fundamental about the space, or perhaps it had changed something fundamental about him. Thomas stirred first, his tiny movements rousing Eliza. Everett turned to find her watching him, her expression thoughtful. "How are you feeling?" he asked, setting aside his coffee. "Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo," she answered with a weak smile. "But alive. We're both alive, thanks to you." Everett shook his head. "You did all the hard work." "Not all of it." Her gaze was steady, appraising. "You could have turned me away." "No," he said simply. "I couldn't have." She nodded as if he'd confirmed something she already knew. "The storms passed just before dawn. I need to check the damage. See about clearing a path to the shed. Got an old snowmobile there that might get us down to the ranger station if the fuel hasn't gelled." "I should feed him first," Eliza said, adjusting her position to nurse Thomas. "We'll need to prepare for the journey," Everett nodded, grabbing his heavy coat and gloves. "I'll give you some privacy." Outside, the cold hit like a physical blow, stealing his breath. The snow reached nearly to his waist in places, making each step a labor. He pushed through to the small shed about 30 yards from the cabin, muscles burning with the effort. Inside, the snowmobile waited beneath a tarp. Along with his tools and additional supplies, it would take hours to clear a path wide enough, but it could be done. By the time he returned, cheeks numb and fingers stinging despite his gloves, Eliza had managed to rise from bed. She sat in his lone chair, Thomas swaddled tightly in her arms, looking more alert than he would have expected after her ordeal. "The snowmobile will work?" she asked as he stamped snow from his boots. "Should, once I dig it out and warm the engine, but it'll be a rough ride down, especially with a newborn." He hesitated. "If you can wait a day or two, you'll be stronger for the journey." She bit her lip, considering, is it safe to stay? "What about supplies?" "We're fine for supplies," he assured her. "I stock up before winter, and yes, it's safe. The worst storms usually come with some space between them. Weather feels stable for now." Relief softened her features. "Then waiting makes sense. I'm not sure I could manage the trip today anyway." Everett nodded, feeling oddly grateful for the reprieve. "I'll keep working on clearing a path, just to be ready." The day passed in a pattern of Everett working outside, then returning to warm up and check on Eliza and Thomas. She grew stronger by the hour, moving carefully around the cabin, helping prepare meals with Thomas cradled in one arm. They settled into an unexpectedly comfortable routine, conversation flowing more easily than Everett would have thought possible after years of speaking to almost no one. By evening, he had cleared a path to the shed and begun the work of freeing the snowmobile. His body ached pleasantly from the exertion, a different kind of tired than he was used to. Inside, Eliza had managed to heat water for a makeshift bath behind a blanket strung across the corner of the cabin. "You should eat," she said when he entered, gesturing to a plate of reheated stew she'd set near the fire. "You've been working all day." The simple act of someone preparing food for him felt foreign, almost forgotten. "Thank you." They ate together, Thomas sleeping nearby in a drawer Everett had emptied and lined with soft clothing to serve as a cradle. The domesticity of the scene struck him suddenly. How quickly humans adapted, how easily they fell into patterns of togetherness, even after prolonged solitude. "Tell me about Thomas's father," he said eventually, curiosity finally overcoming his natural reticence. "You mentioned a bad situation back east." Eliza's expression clouded. She set down her spoon, eyes fixed on the sleeping infant. "That's complicated." "I'm sorry," Everett backtracked immediately. "It's none of my business." "No, it's all right," she sighed. "You've saved our lives. You deserve some truth." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I was married to a man named James Walsh, a businessman from Boston, well respected from an old family. The perfect life, and from the outside," her fingers twisted the edge of her blanket, "but behind closed doors he was different. Controlling at first, then cruel. When I told him I was pregnant, things got worse. He didn't want a child, or at least not with me, as it turned out. He was already planning to leave me for someone else." Everett felt a familiar anger rising. "Did he hurt you?" "The last time was bad enough that I ended up in the hospital. I told the doctors I fell down the stairs." Her voice had gone flat, emotionless. "When I was discharged, I went home, packed what I could carry, and left. My sister in Bozeman is the only family I have left. James doesn't know where she lives." "Does he know about the baby?" She nodded, her hand moving protectively to Thomas. "And he knows I was pregnant, but he made it very clear he wanted nothing to do with it, as he called our child. Said it would ruin his new engagement to properly question the paternity." The injustice of it burned in Everett's chest. "You're safe here," he said, the words emerging as a promise, "for as long as you need." Eliza's eyes glistened in the firelight. "Thank you, but we can't impose forever. Once we get to Bozeman, let's just focus on getting you both strong enough for the journey," Everett interrupted gently. "One day at a time," she nodded, wiping quickly at her eyes. "You've been alone up here for 5 years. No visitors at all. The occasional ranger stops by in summer, make sure I'm still breathing. Supply runs to town every few months. Otherwise, just me. Doesn't it get lonely?" The question was asked without judgment, just genuine curiosity. Everett considered his answer carefully. "I thought I preferred it that way. After Sarah, after losing the baby, being around people hurt too much. Their pity, their awkward attempts at comfort. Up here, the mountains don't pity you. They just are." And now her eyes held his. searching. And now I'm not so sure anymore, he admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. Later, as they prepared for sleep, Eliza and Thomas in his bed, Everett on his pallet by the fire, she asked one more question, her voice already heavy with approaching slumber. What was her name? The daughter you lost. The question hung in the quiet cabin. For a moment, Everett thought he might not answer, the name trapped behind years of carefully constructed defenses. But something had shifted these past 2 days. Emma, he said softly. We were going to call her Emma. Eliza didn't respond. Her breathing already deepened into sleep. But having spoken the name aloud for the first time in years, Everett felt a weight lift slightly from his chest. He stared into the dying embers of the fire, listening to the soft sounds of mother and child sleeping nearby, and wondered at the strange turns life could take. Outside, the moon rose over a landscape transformed by storm, its light casting long blue shadows across unblemished snow. In the distance, a wolf howled, a lonely sound that carried for miles in the clear, cold air. Everett listened, no longer quite as alone as he had been just days before. The next morning brought a troubling development. Everett woke before dawn, habit pulling him from sleep despite his exhaustion. In the dim light, he could make out Eliza's form on the bed, curled protectively around Thomas. But something was wrong. Her breathing seemed labored, and when he approached, heat radiated from her like a furnace. Eliza! He touched her shoulder gently. She stirred, eyes opening with effort. Everett, is it morning already? You're burning up, he said, pressing the back of his hand to her forehead. The skin was hot and dry, unmistakably feverish. I don't feel right, she admitted, struggling to sit up. Everything aches. Alarm coursed through him. Fever after childbirth could mean infection, a dangerous, potentially deadly complication, especially here, miles from medical help. He had basic supplies, alcohol, clean bandages, willow bark for pain and fever, but nothing that would combat a serious infection. How's Thomas? She asked, her concern immediate despite her condition. Everett checked the sleeping infant. Seems fine, pink and breathing easy. Relief softened her features momentarily before another wave of pain made her wince. Good. That's good. Everett helped her drink water, then steeped willow bark in hot water for tea. It wouldn't be enough if she truly had an infection, but it might help with the fever temporarily. The timing couldn't be worse. They had planned to attempt the journey down the mountain today, now that the snow had settled, and Eliza had had a day to recover from the birth. We need to get you to a doctor, he said, watching her struggle to drink the bitter tea. I know, she whispered, but I don't think I can make that trip right now. He paced the small cabin, mind racing. The ranger station was 15 miles down the mountain, a challenging trip by snowmobile even in good conditions, nearly impossible with a sick woman and newborn. The nearest town was another 10 miles beyond that. I could go for help, he said finally. Bring back a doctor. Or at least medication. Fear flashed in Eliza's eyes. And leave us here, alone. It would be faster than trying to transport you both. I could make it to the ranger station in a couple of hours, be back by nightfall with help. She looked at Thomas, then back to Everett, indecision clear in her flushed face. What if something happens while you're gone? I'll leave you everything you need. Water, food within reach. The rifle. He knelt beside the bed. Eliza, your fever's getting worse. We don't have many options. After a long moment, she nodded. Okay, but hurry back. Everett worked quickly, positioning everything Eliza might need within her reach. Water, food, extra blankets. He checked and loaded his rifle, placing it beside the bed where she could reach it if necessary. Then he bundled himself in his warmest clothes, preparing for the journey. I'll be back as soon as I can, he promised, pausing at the door. And keep the fire going. There's plenty of wood stacked beside the hearth. Eliza nodded weakly. Thomas clutched to her chest. Be careful. The brightness outside was blinding after the cabin's dimness. Everett trudged through the cleared path to the shed, where he'd prepared the snowmobile the previous day. The machine started after several attempts, the engine sputtering in the cold before catching with a roar. He offered a silent prayer of thanks. Without the snowmobile, the journey would take days instead of hours. The ride down the mountain was treacherous. Despite the clear sky, the trail was nearly invisible beneath fresh snow, forcing Everett to navigate by memory and instinct. Twice, he nearly crashed into snow-covered obstacles, the machine fishtailing wildly before he regained control. His hands grew numb, despite his gloves, and his face burned from the cold wind. He reached the ranger station just after noon, relieved to find it occupied. Ranger Mike Peterson, a grizzled veteran of the Forest Service, listened with growing concern as Everett explained the situation. "Christ, Morgan, a berth in your cabin, and now she's sick." Peterson shook his head. "Phone lines are down from the storm, but I've got a radio. I'll call for a medical evacuation, but it'll take time to organize in these conditions. What about antibiotics? Anything we can use in the meantime?" Peterson rummaged through the station's first aid supplies, producing a small bottle. "I've got amoxicillin left from when I had that tooth infection last month. Not much, but it might help until we can get her proper treatment." Everett accepted the medication gratefully. "How soon can we expect help?" "If the weather holds, they might get a helicopter up there by tomorrow morning." Peterson's expression was grey. "But if her fever's as bad as you say, you should prepare for the possibility that might not be soon enough." The word struck Everett like a physical blow. Not soon enough. He thought of Sarah, of how quickly things had gone wrong, of the helplessness he'd felt watching her slip away despite the best medical care available. And now, Eliza, alone in his cabin with her newborn son, fighting a battle he wasn't sure she could win. "I'm heading back up," he said, already moving toward the door. "Radio if there's any update on the evacuation." "Morgan," Peterson called after him, "be careful. Another storm's moving in tomorrow afternoon. If they can't get that helicopter in before it hits." He left the thought unfinished, but Everett understood. They'd be trapped again, possibly for days. The journey back up the mountain seemed to take an eternity. The sun was already low in the sky, shadows lengthening across the snow, when Everett finally spotted the cabin. No smoke rose from the chimney, he realized with a spike of alarm. The fire had gone out. He pushed the snowmobile to its limits, covering the final distance in a reckless rush. Jumping off before the machine had fully stopped, he crashed through the door, fear a metallic taste in his mouth. Inside, the cabin was cold and dim. Eliza lay on the bed, eyes closed, her skin ghostly pale except for 2 spots of vivid color high on her cheeks. Thomas was awake beside her, making small, distressed sounds but not fully crying. "Eliza," Everett dropped to his knees beside the bed, touching her face. Her skin burned against his cold fingers. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first. "Everett, you came back." "Of course I came back," he said, relief making his voice rough. "I promised, didn't I?" He worked quickly, rebuilding the fire, heating water, preparing a dose of the antibiotics Peterson had provided. Eliza managed to swallow the pill, though it clearly took tremendous effort. Thomas, hungry and distressed, quieted once Everett helped Eliza position him to nurse. "Help is coming," he told her, bathing her forehead with cool water. "A medical evacuation. They'll be here by morning if the weather holds." She nodded weakly. "I'm sorry about the fire. I tried to add wood, but I got so dizzy." "Don't apologize. Just rest. Save your strength." As night descended, Everett maintained his vigil. He coaxed Eliza to drink whenever she woke, monitored her temperature, kept the fire blazing. Thomas, sensing his mother's distress, became increasingly fussy. Everett found himself walking the tiny perimeter of the cabin with the infant in his arms, humming tunelessly, offering what comfort he could to this days-old life already facing such uncertainty. In the darkest hours before dawn, Eliza's fever spiked dangerously high. She tossed restlessly, murmuring words Everett couldn't catch, her face flushed and strained. He bathed her with cool water, his heart pounding with fear. If the helicopter couldn't make it through, if the storm Peterson had warned about arrived early, "Stay with me, Eliza," he whispered, clasping her too hot hand in his. "Thomas needs you. He stopped, surprised by the words that had nearly escaped. "Just stay." Whether from the antibiotics or sheer determination, Eliza's fever broke just as the first grey light of dawn crept through the window. Everett, who had dozed off briefly in the chair beside the bed, woke to find her watching him, her eyes clear for the first time in hours. "You look terrible," she said, her voice weak but lucid. A laugh, surprised and relieved, escaped him. "You're one to talk." She smiled faintly, then grew serious. "Thank you for everything." Before he could respond, a sound reached them, the distant but unmistakable thrum of helicopter blades. Help had arrived. What happened next unfolded with dizzying speed. The medical team landed in a cleared area about a quarter-mile from the cabin, hiking in with a stretcher and equipment. They assessed Eliza quickly, confirmed the postpartum infection, and administered stronger antibiotics through an IV. Thomas was examined and declared remarkably healthy despite his dramatic entry into the world. As they prepared for transport, one of the medics, a woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, turned to Everett. "You saved their lives, you know. Both of them. Another day without treatment, and we might have lost her." The words settled heavily on his shoulders, a weight and a gift. For 5 years, he had been running from death. Now, somehow, he had helped preserve life instead. Standing in the swirling snow as the helicopter lifted off, Eliza and Thomas secured inside, Everett felt strangely hollow. The cabin behind him, so recently filled with the sounds of life, now waited silent and empty. He should have felt relief they were safe, getting proper medical care. Instead, an unexpected sense of loss washed over him. "You're welcome to come with us," one of the medics had offered, but Everett had declined. He had the animals to care for, he'd explained. Couldn't leave them. A convenient truth that masked the deeper reason. He wasn't ready to leave his sanctuary, to face the world he'd abandoned 5 years ago. So he watched until the helicopter disappeared beyond the ridge, then turned back to his solitary life. But the cabin felt different now, haunted not by grief as it had been for years, but by the memory of Eliza's soft laughter, the tiny sounds Thomas made in his sleep, the unexpected warmth of human connection. He moved through his routine mechanically, tending the animals, checking his traps, chopping wood, but the rhythm that had sustained him for so long now felt offbeat, discordant. At night, he found himself staring at the empty bed where Eliza had lain, at the makeshift cradle he hadn't yet disassembled. A week passed, then another. The storm ranger Peterson had predicted arrived and departed, dumping another foot of snow before moving eastward. Everett's thoughts kept returning to Eliza and Thomas, wondering if they'd made it safely to Bozeman, if the infection had fully cleared, if Thomas was thriving. He told himself it was natural to be concerned. Anyone would wonder after such an intense shared experience, but he knew it was more than that. During his monthly supply run to the nearest town, a small outpost called Pine Creek, Everett found himself asking at the general store if anyone had heard about a medical evacuation from the mountains, a young mother and newborn. The shopkeeper, Mary Donovan, who had known Everett as the taciturn trapper who barely spoke during his infrequent visits, seemed surprised by his interest. "There was some talk about it," she said, eyeing him curiously. "Helicopter took them to the hospital in Bozeman, I heard. They both pulled through just fine." Relief loosened something in Everett's chest. "Good, that's good. Friend of yours?" Mary asked, handing him his change. Just someone I helped during the storm," he replied vaguely. Mary nodded, though her expression suggested she sensed there was more to the story. World needs more helpers these days. Back at the cabin, Everett found himself lingering over the carving he'd been working on, a small wooden fox, more detailed than his usual work. Without fully acknowledging his intention, he'd been crafting it for Thomas, a gift the child would likely never receive. The radio crackled to life that evening, startling him. He kept the emergency channel open during winter months, but it rarely activated. "Morgan, you there? It's Peterson." Everett grabbed the handset. "I'm here. What's wrong?" "Nothing wrong. Got a message for you, though, from that woman you helped, Eliza Walsh. She's been trying to reach you." Everett's pulse quickened. "Is she all right?" "The baby. Both fine. According to what I heard, she left a number where you can reach her. Got something to write with." Everett scribbled the number on a scrap of paper, staring at it long after Peterson signed off. A connection to the outside world, to Eliza and Thomas, a choice. It took him 3 days to work up the courage to make the call, driving down to the ranger station where the only reliable phone existed for miles. Peterson tactfully left him alone in the office, the door closing with a soft click. Everett stared at the phone, the paper with Eliza's number clutched in his hand. What would he even say? The digits seemed to blur before his eyes. Before he could lose his nerve, he dialed, each number deliberate and final. She answered on the third ring, her voice exactly as he remembered, though stronger now. "Hello, Eliza? It's Everett. Morgan, A beat of silence. Then, "Everett, I was hoping you'd call. How are you?" "I'm fine. More importantly, how are you? How's Thomas?" "We're both doing well. The infection cleared up quickly once I got proper antibiotics. Thomas is gaining weight and keeping me up all hours." Her laugh was warm, genuine. "My sister's been a godsend." "I'm glad," he said, meaning it deeply. "Everett," her voice grew serious, "I never properly thanked you. What you did for us, anyone would have done the same," he interrupted, uncomfortable with gratitude. "No," she said firmly, "not anyone, and we both know it." Silence stretched between them, charged with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Eliza spoke again, her tone careful. "I was wondering if you might want to visit sometime. When the weather clears, I'd like Thomas to meet the man who helped bring him into the world." The invitation caught him off guard. Visit Bozeman, leave his mountain. The idea both terrified and tempted him. "I don't know," he admitted. "It's not easy for me to get away. The animal, the cabin." "Of course," she said quickly. "I understand. It was just a thought." He heard the disappointment she tried to mask, and something twisted in his chest. "No, maybe in the spring," he found himself saying. "When the pass is clear, really." Hope brightened her voice. "That would be wonderful. No pressure, though, just if you can." They talked a while longer, about Thomas's growth, about her recovery, about her sister's home where they were staying. Everett found himself sharing small details of his life too. The fox he was carving, the early signs of spring he'd noticed despite the lingering snow. Conversation came easier than he would have expected after years of near silence. When they finally said goodbye, a promise to speak again in a few weeks hanging between them, Everett sat in Peterson's office for a long time, the dial tone eventually giving way to an automated message before he replaced the receiver. "Everything okay?" Peterson asked when Everett emerged. "Yeah," Everett replied, surprised to find it was true. "Everything's fine." The weeks that followed brought subtle changes. Everett still maintained his solitary routines, but something had shifted in his perspective. He found himself noticing details he'd overlooked for years: the first green shoots pushing through melting snow, the return of birdsong to the forest, the changing quality of light as winter reluctantly released its grip on the mountain. He called Eliza every few weeks, their conversations becoming a lifeline to a world he'd almost forgotten. She sent a photograph. Thomas at 3 months, chubby-cheeked and solemn-eyed, a tuft of dark hair standing straight up. Everett found himself studying the image in quiet moments, tracing the infant's features with a careful finger. As promised, when the mountain passes finally cleared in late spring, Everett prepared for the journey to Bozeman. He hadn't left his mountain for longer than a supply run in 5 years. The prospect filled him with equal parts anticipation and dread. Peterson agreed to check on the cabin and animals while he was gone. "About time you rejoined the land of the living," the ranger said gruffly, clapping him on the shoulder. The drive to Bozeman took nearly 4 hours, the truck Everett rarely used protesting after months of disuse. The city, though not large by most standards, felt overwhelming after so long in isolation. Too many people, too much noise, too many choices. He nearly turned around twice before finally finding the address Eliza had provided, a modest house on a quiet street lined with mature trees. He sat in the truck for several minutes, gathering his courage. What was he doing here? What did he expect to find? Before he could talk himself out of it, he grabbed the wooden fox from the passenger seat and approached the door. Eliza answered his knock, Thomas balanced on her hip. Her smile of welcome was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "You came?" she said simply. "I said I would," he replied, suddenly awkward. He held out the carved fox. "For Thomas!" The baby, now 6 months old, regarded Everett with solemn curiosity before breaking into a gummy smile that transformed his entire face. The resemblance struck Everett with unexpected force, something in the shape of the eyes, the set of the small chin, familiar in a way that made no sense. "Would you like to hold him?" Eliza asked. Everett hesitated, then nodded. As she transferred Thomas into his arms, the baby reached up with perfect confidence and patted Everett's bearded cheek. Something cracked open inside him, a dam breaking after years of carefully contained emotion. "Come inside," Eliza said gently. "There's something I need to tell you." He followed her into the house, Thomas still in his arm, unaware that his world was about to change forever. Eliza's sister's home was modest but warm, with sunlight streaming through wide windows and family photographs lining the walls. She led Everett to a comfortable living room where toys were scattered across a colorful rug. Thomas babbled happily in Everett's arms, seemingly content with this stranger who had helped bring him into the world. "He likes you," Eliza observed, gesturing for Everett to sit on the sofa. "He's usually more cautious with new people." Everett settled awkwardly, unfamiliar with holding an infant for any length of time. Thomas immediately reached for his beard again, fascinated by the texture. "Your sister isn't home?" Everett asked, noticing the quiet house. "She's at work, teaching kindergarten." Eliza sat opposite him, her posture betraying tension despite her welcoming smile. "I wanted us to have this conversation privately anyway." Something in her tone made Everett's chest tighten. He gently disentangled Thomas's fingers from his beard, focusing on the child to avoid whatever he saw gathering in Eliza's eyes. "Would you like some coffee first?" she offered. "It's been a long drive for you. Just say what you need to say, Eliza," he replied quietly. The anticipation was worse than whatever news she might deliver. She nodded, drawing a deep breath. "The story I told you about Thomas's father, about James Walsh, it wasn't entirely accurate." Everett frowned. "What do you mean?" "James was my husband, and everything I told you about him was true. The control, the cruelty, the affair." Her fingers twisted in her lap. "But he isn't Thomas's biological father." The words hung in the air between them. Thomas squirmed in Everett's arms, sensing the sudden tension, and Eliza reached to take him, settling him on her knee. "I don't understand," Everett said finally. "If not your husband, then who?" Eliza met his gaze directly. Something like fear and hope mingled in her expression. "5 years ago, I lived in Portland. I was just starting my career as a nurse. There was a man I met, a carpenter who specialized in historic renovation. We had a brief relationship, intense but short-lived. He was married, though I didn't know it at first." The blood drained from Everett's face as understanding began to dawn. The room seemed to tilt around him. "When I discovered he had a wife," Eliza continued, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it, "I ended things immediately. I never told him that I was pregnant. A month later, I met James Walsh at a hospital fundraiser. He was charming, successful, seemed like everything I needed at a vulnerable time. We married quickly. Too quickly. By then, I was already carrying another man's child, but James never knew. He assumed the baby was his." "Portland," Everett repeated, the single word laden with implication. "5 years ago." Eliza nodded. "You were that carpenter, Everett. I didn't realize it at first when you rescued me. You've changed so much, and it had been so long. But as we talked in your cabin, as you told me about your past, about Sarah, I knew." The revelation struck him like a physical blow. His mind raced back through those weeks in his cabin, Thomas's familiar features that he couldn't quite place, the inexplicable connection he'd felt to the infant from the first moment. "Thomas is..." He couldn't complete the sentence, the possibility too overwhelming. "Your son," Eliza confirmed softly. "Biologically, yes." Everett stood abruptly, needing space, air, distance from the magnitude of what she was telling him. He moved to the window, staring unseeing at the quiet street outside. "Why didn't you tell me? In the cabin, when you realized who I was. You were already dealing with so much, helping a stranger give birth during a blizzard, then my infection, and I wasn't completely certain until I saw how much Thomas resembles you. The shape of his eyes, his expressions, there's no doubt now." Everett turned back to face her, his world reshaping itself around this new reality. "I had a right to know." "Yes," she acknowledged. "You did. That's why I've been trying to reach you, why I asked you to come here. I needed to tell you in person, and I needed to be sure before I upended your life with this." Thomas began to fuss, picking up on the emotional currents in the room. Eliza soothed him automatically, her eyes never leaving Everett's face. "I'm not asking for anything from you," she said. I don't expect you to suddenly become a father if that's not what you want. I just thought you should know the truth. The irony wasn't lost on Everett. He, who had fled to the mountains to escape the grief of losing his child and wife, had unknowingly fathered another child, a son who, through some twist of fate or divine intervention, had been brought to his very doorstep in the midst of a blizzard. Does anyone else know? He asked, his voice rough. Only my sister. She's the only family I have left. Eliza hesitated. But James never suspected. We were estranged. By the time I started showing, he had already moved on to his new relationship. Everett rubbed a hand over his face, struggling to process everything. I need some air, he said finally. Of course. Eliza's voice was small, resigned. Take all the time you need. He walked for nearly an hour through the unfamiliar neighborhood, mind reeling. Thomas was his son, the child he'd helped deliver, whose first breath he'd witnessed, whose tiny hand had wrapped around his finger in those initial moments of life, his own flesh and blood. The revelation should have filled him with joy, but instead, complicated emotions tangled in his chest. Anger at Eliza for keeping this from him, even briefly. Guilt for the affair that had led to Thomas's conception. He'd been married to Sarah then, though their relationship had been strained after multiple failed attempts to conceive. Grief for the daughter he'd lost and the life with Sarah he'd once envisioned, and beneath it all, a tentative, fragile hope he scarcely dared acknowledge. By the time he returned to the house, Everett had reached no clear conclusions, but the initial shock had subsided. He found Eliza in the kitchen, preparing lunch, while Thomas napped in a portable crib nearby. She looked up when he entered, wariness and hope mingling in her expression. You came back. I said I would, he replied, the same words he'd spoken earlier, though now laden with new meaning. How are you feeling? She asked, setting aside the sandwich she'd been making. Overwhelmed, he admitted. I don't know what to think yet. Or what happens next, Eliza nodded. That's fair. I've had months to adjust to the idea. You've had an hour. Why did you name him Thomas? The question surprised even him, but suddenly it seemed important. A small smile touched her lips. It was my grandfather's name, like I told you, but also your middle name is Thomas, isn't it? I remembered that. At least, the thoughtfulness of this gesture, honoring his connection to the child even when he'd been unaware of it, struck Everett deeply. I'd like to stay in town for a few days, he said finally. Get to know him, figure things out. Relief softened Eliza's features. You can stay here if you want. My sister has a spare room, or there's a decent motel downtown if you'd prefer your space. The motel, I think. For now, he wasn't ready for the intimacy of staying under the same roof, not with so much still unsettled between them. Of course. She hesitated, then added, for what it's worth, I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. When we were in your cabin, I was barely processing it myself, recognizing you, realizing the implication, and then with the infection, everything happened so fast. Everett nodded, accepting her explanation if not entirely satisfied by it. I understand. Thomas stirred in his crib, making small waking noises. Without thinking, Everett moved toward him, reaching down to lift the baby before Eliza could react. Thomas blinked up at him, momentarily confused, then broke into that gummy smile that transformed his entire face, a smile Everett now recognized from old photographs of himself as a child. Hey there, little man, he said softly, the words catching in his throat. Something fundamental shifted in that moment, a connection Everett could neither deny nor resist, taking root in his heart. This was his son. Whatever complicated path had led them here, whatever uncertainty clouded the future, that simple truth remained. I'd like to feed him, he said, looking up to find Eliza watching them, tears glistening in her eyes. If that's okay, I'd like to learn how. Of course, she whispered. I'll show you. And so began Everett Morgan's cautious, halting journey into fatherhood, a role he had both longed for and fled from, now thrust upon him by the strangest of circumstances, a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about love, forgiveness, and the healing power of second chances. The days that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm. Everett extended his stay at the motel, calling Peterson to check on the cabin and animals. Each morning, he arrived at Eliza's sister's house just after breakfast, spending the day learning the intricate patterns of his son's life. When he napped, what made him laugh, how he furrowed his brow in concentration when discovering something new. Eliza's sister, Catherine, a warm woman with Eliza's same amber eyes but a more reserved manner, gave them space while offering quiet support. She seemed to understand instinctively the delicate balance they were trying to maintain. "He has your determination," Eliza observed on the third day, watching Thomas doggedly persist in trying to reach a toy just beyond his grasp. And that single-minded focus. Everett felt a surge of pride, followed quickly by a familiar twist of grief. Would Emma have inherited his traits too? Sarah's gentle smile, perhaps, or her artistic eye? As if reading his thoughts, Eliza added softly, "It's okay to think about her, about Emma. Thomas doesn't erase that loss." He looked up, startled by her perception. "I feel guilty sometimes, like I'm betraying them by being here, by feeling what I feel for Thomas." "Sarah would want this for you," Eliza said with quiet certainty. "What mother wouldn't want the father of her child to know love again, to have a relationship with his son?" "You didn't know, Sarah," Everett pointed out, though without heat. "No," Eliza agreed, "but I know what it means to love a child, to want the best for them, no matter what." The observation lingered with Everett that evening as he returned to his motel room. Would Sarah have wanted this for him? The question felt less painful than it once might have. Perhaps time had softened the edges of his grief, or perhaps this unexpected connection with Thomas was healing something he thought would remain broken forever. On the fifth day, Eliza suggested a picnic at a nearby park. The June weather was perfect. Warm sunshine tempered by a gentle breeze that rustled the leaves overhead. They spread a blanket beneath an old oak tree, Thomas propped between them, fascinated by the dappled light filtering through the branches. "Tell me about your life now," Eliza said as they shared sandwiches and lemonade. "The trapping, the mountain. Is it what you hoped for when you left Portland?" Everett considered the question. "It's what I needed," he answered finally. "Not what I hoped for. I wasn't hoping for anything then, just trying to survive each day. But the solitude helped, the simplicity. And now?" Her question was careful, neutral. "Now I'm not sure anymore." He reached out to steady Thomas, who was attempting to roll over. 5 years is a long time to be alone." The admission hung between them, laden with implications neither was ready to address directly. "Whatever you decide about Thomas," Eliza said after a moment, "I want you to know he'll always be part of your life if you want. We can figure out arrangements, visits. I won't keep him from you." The generosity of her offer struck him. She could have kept the truth hidden forever. He would never have known about Thomas if fate hadn't brought them together in that blizzard. "Thank you," he said simply. "That means more than I can say." As they packed up the remains of their picnic, Thomas dozing in the portable carrier Eliza had brought, Everett made a decision that had been forming gradually over the past days. "I'm going back to the mountain tomorrow," he announced. Disappointment flashed across Eliza's face, though she quickly masked it. "Of course, you have responsibilities there. Will you visit again soon?" "That's not what I meant," he clarified. "I'm going back to pack up the cabin, make arrangements for the animals. I need to close that chapter properly." Hope replaced disappointment in her expression. And then I thought I might look for work around here. Carpentry jobs, maybe. I've been away from it for years, but the skills don't disappear." He hesitated. "If that would be all right with you and Catherine." "More than all right," Eliza said softly. "But Everett, I don't want you to feel obligated. This has to be what you truly want." "It is," he replied, surprising himself with the certainty he felt. "Thomas deserves a father who's present in his life, and I think I'm ready to stop running." The truth of it settled in his chest, both terrifying and liberating. For 5 years, he'd been existing rather than living, marking time in isolation. Thomas offered a second chance he hadn't known he was seeking. The drive back to his mountain the next day felt different from any journey he'd made before. The landscape remained the same, towering pines, rugged peaks, the occasional glimpse of wildlife, but Everett viewed it now through altered eyes. No longer a refuge, but a way station, a place that had served its purpose in his life, sheltering him while wounds slowly healed, but not his final destination. Peterson met him at the cabin, eyebrows rising in surprise when Everett explained his plans. "Never thought I'd see the day," the ranger commented, helping him gather tools and personal belongings. "You seemed pretty settled up here." "Things changed," Everett replied simply. "That woman and her baby," Peterson said, understanding dawning. "They got under your skin, huh?" "More than you know," Everett thought, but merely nodded. It took 3 days to properly close up the cabin, find homes for his livestock, and pack what he wanted to take with him. The rest, furniture, tools too large to transport, supplies he no longer needed, he left for Peterson to distribute as he saw fit. On the final evening, Everett stood outside the cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. This place had saved him once, providing sanctuary when the world seemed too painful to bear. He felt gratitude rather than regret as he bid it silent farewell. The return to Bozeman brought new challenges: finding housing, looking for work, establishing a life near Eliza and Thomas without presuming too much too quickly. Catherine offered her spare room temporarily while he searched for an apartment, a generosity that touched him deeply. Work proved easier to find than he'd anticipated. Bozeman was growing, construction booming, and skilled carpenters were in demand. Within 2 weeks, he'd secured a position with a company specializing in custom cabinetry and furniture, work that utilized his craftsmanship while allowing flexibility for his evolving family situation. Family. The word still caught him off guard when it surfaced in his thoughts. Yet watching Thomas' master rolling over, hearing his first genuine laugh, becoming familiar with the subtle differences between his hungry cry and his tired fussing, Everett was forming attachments that grew stronger each day. His relationship with Eliza developed more cautiously. They were connected irrevocably through Thomas, but the circumstances of their reunion and the complicated history between them required delicate navigation. They agreed to focus on co-parenting first, allowing any deeper feelings to evolve naturally without pressure. "I've been thinking about something," Eliza said one evening as they sat on Catherine's porch after putting Thomas to bed. The summer twilight lingered, fireflies beginning to flicker in the garden. "And about fate, coincidence, whatever you want to call it. What about it?" Everett asked, relaxed in the comfortable silence they'd learned to share. "The odds that I would end up at your specific cabin, in that specific blizzard, when there are thousands of square miles of wilderness in Montana." She turned to face him, expression thoughtful. "It seems impossible, doesn't it? When you put it that way, yes," he acknowledged. "Though you were following the main road before your car broke down, my cabin isn't that far off the route to Bozeman." "Still," she persisted, "of all the places I could have ended up, I found the father of my child. A man I hadn't seen in 5 years, whose last name I barely remembered." Everett considered this. "What are you saying? That it was meant to be?" "I don't know about meant to be," she replied, "but it feels significant, like something larger than us was at work." He wasn't a man given to mystical thinking, but even he had to admit the coincidence strained credibility. That Eliza should deliver their son in his cabin, that he should be the one to help bring Thomas into the world. It carried a symmetry that seemed deliberate, almost designed. "Maybe," he conceded, "or maybe it's just what we tell ourselves to make sense of the randomness." Eliza smiled. "The trapper turns philosopher. The mountain changed you. Everything changed me," he corrected gently. "Sarah, Emma, the years alone. You and Thomas. We're all just collections of our experiences, aren't we?" She reached for his hand. Then, her fingers warm against his, a simple touch but laden with possibility. "I'm glad it was your cabin I found," she said softly. Whatever the reason." In that moment, beneath a darkening sky sprinkled with emerging stars, Everett Morgan began to believe that perhaps the path forward didn't have to be walked alone. Summer gave way to autumn, the Bozeman landscape transforming in a blaze of gold and crimson. Thomas grew with astonishing speed, babbling his first recognizable sounds, sitting up unassisted, developing distinct preferences and an increasingly defined personality. Everett found himself cataloging each milestone with a wonder that never diminished. The first time Thomas reached for him specifically, the way his son's face lit up when he entered a room. By October, Everett had settled into a small but comfortable apartment within walking distance of Catherine's house. 2 bedrooms, one for himself, one for Thomas, during the 3 nights a week he stayed over. These overnight visits had begun cautiously, Eliza understandably protective of their son. But as her trust in Everett's parenting abilities grew, so did the time he spent alone with Thomas. The arrangement wasn't without challenges, occasional disagreements about schedules, parenting approaches, boundaries, the lingering awkwardness of their past connection and the complex emotions it still stirred. But underlying it all was a mutual commitment to Thomas's well-being and a deepening respect that sometimes felt like it might be growing into something more. "He has your stubbornness," Eliza observed one afternoon, watching Thomas repeatedly attempt to stack blocks that kept toppling. "Won't give up even when it's clearly not working." "Determination," Everett corrected with a smile. "And he gets his patience from you? I've seen how you handle the fussy nights." They exchanged these observations often, cataloging the traits Thomas inherited from each of them. Everett's quiet focus, Eliza's quick smile, the way they both tilted their heads when concentrating. It was a subtle way of acknowledging their shared connection through their son, of building a narrative that included them both. One crisp November evening, Everett invited Eliza to dinner at his apartment after she dropped Thomas off for his regular visit. She accepted with only slight hesitation, the first time they would share a meal without Thomas present since he'd moved to Bozeman. "Something smells amazing," she commented as she entered, unwinding a scarf from around her neck. The temperature had dropped sharply in recent days, winter announcing its approach. "Venison stew," Everett replied, stirring the pot simmering on his stove, "with vegetables from the farmer's market. One advantage of all those years in the mountains, I learned to cook. Out of necessity, I imagine," she teased, accepting the glass of wine he offered. "Survival is a powerful motivator." He gestured toward the small dining table he'd set. "It's almost ready." Conversation flowed easily over dinner, more relaxed than Everett had anticipated. They discussed Thomas, of course, but other topics too. Eliza's plans to return to nursing part-time, Everett's growing client list for custom furniture pieces, books they'd read recently, changes in Bozeman, since Everett had last lived in a town of any size. "I have something to show you," he said, as they finished eating. He disappeared briefly into his bedroom, returning with a worn, leather-bound journal. "I found this when I was packing up the cabin." Eliza accepted it curiously. "A journal from my first year on the mountain, after Sarah died." He sat beside her on the small sofa. "I'd forgotten about it until I was clearing out the desk." She looked at him questioningly, understanding the significance of what he was sharing. "Are you sure you want me to see this?" He nodded. "I've been reading through it since I found it. It's difficult, but I think it might help you understand why I was there, who I was when you found me." Eliza opened the journal carefully, her expression softening as she took in the jagged, emotional handwriting that filled the early pages. Raw grief poured onto paper when Everett had no one else to hear it. She read in silence, occasionally glancing up at him, her eyes compassionate but not pitying. "You loved her very much," she said finally, closing the journal. "I did," he agreed. "But reading this again, I realized something. The man who wrote those entries isn't who I am anymore. That grief, it's still part of me, but it's not all of me. Not anymore." "What changed?" she asked, though her eyes suggested she might already know the answer. "Time, partly," he replied. "The mountain, the solitude, but mostly," he hesitated, then continued with quiet certainty, "mostly it was Thomas and you." The admission hung between them, a truth finally voiced aloud. Eliza's hand found his, fingers intertwining naturally. "I never expected any of this," she said softly. "When I left Boston, I was just trying to survive, to protect my baby. I never imagined finding you again, or what it might mean." "What does it mean?" Everett asked, the question encompassing far more than the words themselves. Instead of answering directly, Eliza leaned forward, closing the distance between them. The kiss was gentle, questioning, a beginning rather than a culmination. When she pulled back, her eyes searched his, looking for confirmation that he felt what she did, this unexpected second chance neither had been seeking. "I think," she said carefully, "it means we have a chance to build something, not just for Thomas, but for ourselves too. If that's what you want." "It is," he replied simply. "It has been for a while now." They moved forward cautiously after that night, both aware of the stakes involved. Thomas remained their priority, his needs coming before their evolving relationship. They kept their living arrangements separate, carved out time for dates, while ensuring Thomas had the stability of his established routine. Catherine, perceptive as always, offered support without intrusion, babysitting when needed, giving them space to discover each other beyond their roles as co-parents. "I never asked you," Everett said one evening as they walked through a park dusted with the first snow of winter. Thomas bundled against the cold in the stroller Everett pushed. "Why did you decide to head to Bozeman in the middle of winter? Why not wait until spring, when the journey would have been safer?" Eliza was quiet for a moment, her breath visible in the frosty air. "James found out where I was staying in Missoula," she finally replied. "Oh, a mutual acquaintance let it slip. I panicked. Catherine was the only family I had left, the only safe place I could think of." The revelation made Everett's jaw tighten. "Has he tried to contact you since?" "Once, shortly after Thomas was born. Catherine told him I wasn't living with her anymore, that she didn't know where I'd gone." She shrugged. "It wasn't entirely a lie. I was in the hospital with the infection then." "He hasn't tried again. Do you think he will?" The protectiveness in Everett's voice surprised even him. "I don't know. He's remarried now, starting a new life. I'm hoping he's forgotten about us." They walked in silence for a while, the implications hanging between them. Finally, Everett spoke, his voice low but determined. "If he ever does show up, you're not alone anymore. You know that, right?" Eliza smiled, slipping her gloved hand into his. "And I know." As Christmas approached, bringing with it Thomas's first birthday, they faced a new challenge, integrating their individual holiday traditions, navigating family celebrations that now included each other. Everett had spent the past 5 Christmases alone on his mountain, marking the day with little more than a moment of silent remembrance for what he'd lost. The prospect of a family Christmas, lights and gifts and celebration, stirred complicated emotion. "We can keep it low-key," Eliza assured him when he expressed his hesitation. "Thomas is too young to remember anyway. The important thing is that we're together." Together. The word resonated with Everett in ways he hadn't expected when he'd first made the decision to leave his mountain sanctuary. He'd come to Bozeman for Thomas, to be the father his son deserved. But somewhere along the way, his motivation had expanded to include Eliza and the possibility of a future with her, a second chance at the family he'd thought forever lost to him. One snowy evening, as Thomas slept peacefully in his crib and Eliza helped Everett decorate the small Christmas tree he'd purchased for his apartment, he found himself watching her, the careful way she hung each ornament, the soft smile that appeared whenever she glanced toward the room where their son slept. "What?" she asked, catching his gaze. "And just thinking," he replied, "about how sometimes the things we run from are the very things we're meant to find our way back to." Eliza's smile deepened, understanding the weight behind his words. "Sometimes," she agreed, "the longest journey just leads us home." And standing there in the gentle glow of Christmas lights, Everett Morgan, once a lone trapper who had fled to the wilderness to escape his pain, began to believe that perhaps he had finally found his way home after all. Thomas's first birthday and Christmas arrived in a flurry of gentle celebration. Everett, Eliza, and Catherine gathered in Catherine's cozy living room, watching with shared delight as Thomas, still unsteady on his feet but determined to walk, tore at colorful wrapping paper with more enthusiasm for the process than the gifts themselves. The wooden rocking horse Everett had crafted, hours of careful work in the evenings after Thomas was asleep, elicited genuine excitement from both mother and son. "It's beautiful," Eliza whispered, running her hand over the smooth, polished curves. He'll treasure it forever. Later, after Thomas had been put to bed exhausted from the day's excitement, the three adults sat around the fire with mugs of spiced cider, sharing stories and reflecting on the remarkable year behind them. "I want to make a toast," Catherine said, raising her mug, "to new beginnings, second chances, and the strange paths that lead us exactly where we need to be." They clinked mugs, the simple gesture acknowledging the complex journey that had brought them to this moment. As the evening wound down, Everett helped with cleanup while Eliza checked on Thomas one last time. "I've never seen her this happy," Catherine commented quietly as they washed dishes side by side. "Not since we were kids, before our parents died." Everett glanced at her, surprised by the personal observation from the usually reserved woman. "She's been through a lot. So have you," Catherine replied, her gaze direct. "But sometimes the people who understand pain best are the ones who can help us heal from it." Before he could respond, Eliza returned, and the moment passed. But Catherine's words lingered with Everett as he drove back to his apartment that night. The streets of Bozeman quiet, under a fresh blanket of snow. Winter settled deeply over Montana, bringing frigid temperatures and shortened days. Everett found himself surprisingly content with the rhythm of town life. The regular hours at the woodshop, evenings spent with Thomas and Eliza, weekends filled with simple pleasures like sledding on gentle hills or building elaborate block towers that Thomas delighted in knocking down. In late January, Eliza broached a subject they'd been circling for weeks. "And I've been thinking," she began as they sat together on her sister's couch, Thomas already asleep for the night, "about our living situation." Everett felt a flutter of anticipation. "What about it?" "It's getting complicated, the back and forth. Thomas has 2 homes, half his things in each place." She hesitated, then continued with careful words. "I wonder if it might be better for him, for all of us to consolidate." "You mean move in together?" Everett clarified, wanting to be certain they were having the same conversation. "Yes," she met his gaze steadily, "not just for convenience, but because I think we're ready." If you are," the question carried weight beyond the practical considerations, an acknowledgement of how far they'd come, how much their relationship had deepened over the months since his return from the mountain. "I am," he replied simply. "But your sister, Catherine, understands. She's been expecting this conversation for a while now." Eliza smiled. "She's actually the one who suggested I bring it up." They decided to look for a new place together, somewhere that would be theirs from the beginning, rather than one of them moving into the other's established space. A fresh start, symbolic of the life they were building. They found it in February. A small but charming house near a park, with a fenced yard where Thomas could play as he grew older. 3 bedrooms, a kitchen with large windows that filled the space with light, and most importantly to Everett, a detached garage he could convert into a workshop for his growing side business of custom furniture. "It's perfect," Eliza declared, as they toured it for the second time. "Oh, it feels like home already." Everett watched Thomas toddle excitedly from room to room, babbling with animation at each new discovery, and felt a sense of rightness settle over him. "It does, doesn't it?" They moved in March, combining their possessions with surprising ease. Everett's sparse furnishings from his mountain years complemented Eliza's more practical pieces, creating a home that reflected both their stories. Thomas adapted quickly to the new space, claiming every corner as his territory, with the confident ownership of early childhood. Spring arrived with renewed energy, bringing longer days and the promise of growth. Everett's workshop business flourished as word spread about his craftsmanship. Eliza returned to nursing part-time at the local hospital, a balance that allowed her to maintain her professional identity while still being present for Thomas's formative years. They established routines, navigated minor conflicts, and gradually built the foundation of a shared life. It was in May, just over a year since Everett had first come to Bozeman to meet his son, that the past suddenly intruded on their carefully constructed present. The knock came on a Saturday morning as they were preparing for a picnic in the park. Everett, busy packing Thomas's favorite snacks, heard Eliza answer the door. Then a long silence followed by the sound of her voice. Tense, controlled, but with an undercurrent of fear he recognized immediately. "James, what are you doing here?" Everett set down the container he was holding and moved quickly to the entryway. Eliza stood with one hand still on the door, her posture rigid. Across the threshold stood a man Everett had never seen, but instantly recognized from Eliza's descriptions. Tall, expensively dressed, with the polished appearance of privilege and power. James Walsh's gaze shifted from Eliza to Everett, assessment and calculation visible in his expression. "I see you've moved on," he commented, his tone deliberately casual, though his eyes had narrowed. "And quite the domestic scene. What do you want?" Eliza repeated, her voice steadier now with Everett beside her. "Can't a man check on his ex-wife? See how she's doing?" Walsh's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I was in Bozeman on business and thought I'd stop by. Your sister was kind enough to tell me where to find you." Everett doubted Catherine had offered the information willingly, but kept his expression neutral as he placed a supportive hand on Eliza's lower back. "You've seen that I'm fine," Eliza replied. "Now please leave." Walsh's attention shifted to the living room, visible behind them, where Thomas was playing on a blanket, and the child. "My supposed son?" The possessive language made Everett's jaw tighten, but Eliza spoke before he could respond. "Thomas is not your concern, James. You made that abundantly clear before he was born." "Perhaps I've had a change of heart." Walsh's gaze returned to Everett, challenging. Or perhaps I'm curious about the man playing father to a child who still legally bears my name." The implication hung in the air between them, a veiled threat wrapped in casual observation. Everett felt Eliza tense beside him, but kept his voice level when he finally spoke. "Is there something specific you wanted to discuss, Mr. Walsh? We were just heading out." Walsh studied him with cold appraisal. "You seem familiar somehow. Have we met?" "I don't believe so," Everett replied evenly, though his mind flashed to the affair in Portland years ago. Had Walsh seen photographs of him during his investigation into Eliza's past? "I'm Everett Morgan." "Morgan," Walsh repeated the name slowly. "Well, Mr. Morgan, I was hoping for a private conversation with Eliza about some legal matters. Family business. Anything you have to say to me can be said in front of Everett," Eliza stated firmly. "We don't have secrets." Walsh's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Very well. I've been thinking about my rights regarding the boy. Legally, as you know, I'm still listed as his father on the birth certificate." Eliza paled, her worst fears materializing in Walsh's carefully chosen words. "You've never wanted anything to do with him. You made that clear when you told me to get rid of it when I told you I was pregnant." "People change," Walsh replied with a shrug that didn't quite disguise the calculation behind his eyes. "I've been reconsidering my family obligations, moral responsibilities." Thomas chose that moment to call out, his happy babble drawing all their attention. Everett felt, rather than saw, Eliza's subtle shift closer to him, the instinctive movement of a mother protecting her child. "James," she said, her voice low but firm, "we both know this isn't about Thomas. What do you really want?" The facade of casual interest dropped, replaced by something harder, more honest in its malice. "You left me, Eliza, without warning, without discussion. You humiliated me after you put me in the hospital," she replied quietly. Walsh waved a dismissive hand. "Ancient history. The point is, actions have consequences. I've been patient, given you your space. But perhaps it's time we formalize some arrangements regarding my son." My son. The words struck Everett like a physical blow. Thomas was his son, biologically, emotionally, in every way that mattered, but legally. The birth certificate bore Walsh's name, a fiction created when Eliza had fled her abusive marriage. "I think you should leave now," Everett said, his voice deceptively calm despite the anger building inside him. "If you have legal concerns, you can contact Eliza's lawyer." Walsh's smile returned, cold and satisfied. "I was hoping we could handle this amicably, but if you prefer formal channels, my attorney will be in touch." He glanced past them once more to where Thomas played, oblivious to the tension. "He has her eyes, doesn't he? But not much else. Funny." That the implication wasn't lost on either of them. With a final nod that felt more like a threat than a courtesy, Walsh turned and walked back to the expensive car parked at the curb. As Eliza closed the door, her hands were shaking. "He knows," she whispered. Somehow, he knows Thomas isn't his." The picnic was forgotten as they gathered in the kitchen, Thomas now safely ensconced in his high chair with a snack, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around his future. Catherine arrived shortly after Eliza called her, apologetic and concerned. "He showed up at the school," she explained, still wearing her teaching clothes. "Said he needed to talk to me about an urgent family matter. I told him nothing. Eliza, I swear, but he mentioned he'd hired a private investigator months ago. It doesn't matter how he found us," Everett said, his voice steadier than he felt. "What matters is what we do now." They spent the afternoon making calls, first to a family law attorney Catherine knew, then to friends who could provide character references, documenting the timeline of Thomas's first year and Everett's involvement since his birth. The lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Meredith Jacobs, agreed to meet them Monday morning. That night, after Catherine had gone home and Thomas was asleep, Everett found Eliza sitting on their back porch, staring into the darkness. He settled beside her, wordlessly passing her a mug of tea. "I should have legally established paternity as soon as you came to Bozeman," she said finally. "I just wanted to give us time to figure things out, to be sure about what we were building." "This isn't your fault," Everett replied. "We'll fight this, Eliza, together." She turned to face him, moonlight silvering the tears on her cheek. "You don't understand what he's like, Everett. When James wants something, he gets it by any means necessary. His family has money, connections, and he doesn't even want Thomas. He just wants to hurt me, to punish me for leaving. Why now, though? It's been over a year." "His pride," she said simply. "He can tolerate being left but not being replaced. Seeing you here, seeing us happy. That's what triggered this." Everett took her hand, his larger fingers enveloping hers. "Listen to me. I spent 5 years running from life, hiding from pain on that mountain. I'm not running anymore, and I'm not letting anyone take our son from us. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, we fight." Monday's meeting with the attorney laid out the realities they faced, challenging but not insurmountable. DNA testing would prove Everett's paternity, but the legal process to remove Walsh from the birth certificate and establish Everett's rights would take time. In the interim, Walsh could potentially seek visitation or even temporary custody based on his current legal status as Thomas's father. "Document everything," Meredith advised. "Every interaction with Walsh, every threat, implied or explicit, will file for an emergency order establishing temporary custody with Eliza while the paternity case proceeds." The weeks that followed tested them in ways they hadn't anticipated. Walsh, true to form, engaged high-powered attorneys who filed motion after motion, each designed to delay the DNA testing while seeking immediate visitation rights. The legal costs mounted, straining their finances despite Catherine's help and Everett working extra hours at both his regular job and his workshop. Through it all, they maintained a semblance of normalcy for Thomas's sake. He continued to grow and thrive, speaking more words each day, his personality blossoming with the security of their love. Everett treasured each moment, acutely aware that their time together hung in a precarious balance. The DNA test, when finally ordered by the court, confirmed what they already knew. Thomas was indisputably Everett's biological son. It should have been a turning point, but Walsh's attorneys pivoted smoothly, arguing that biology was less relevant than the established legal relationship and Thomas's best interests. "He's stalling," Meredith explained during one of their regular meetings, "dragging this out as long as possible to drain your resources and wear you down emotionally." "It's working," Eliza admitted, exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. The stress had begun affecting her health, headaches, insomnia, a persistent tension that medication barely touched. Everett felt helpless in the face of her suffering, angry at a system that seemed designed to prolong conflict rather than protect children. His own temper, long subdued during his years of isolation, flared with increasing frequency. Only Thomas's presence kept him grounded, reminded him of what they were fighting for. In August, nearly 3 months into the legal battle, a surprising development shifted the landscape. Walsh's new wife filed for divorce, citing infidelity and emotional abuse. The proceedings, splashed across local business pages due to Walsh's prominence, included damning allegations that echoed Eliza's experiences. "This changes things," Meredith said, calling them with the news. "His attention will be divided, and his pristine image is taking a hit. We should press our advantage." She recommended filing for an immediate hearing on their petition to remove Walsh's name from the birth certificate and legally establish Everett as Thomas's father. The strategy carried risk, forcing a decision before they'd fully built their case, but also potential reward if Walsh was too distracted by his divorce to mount a strong opposition. The gamble paid off. 3 days before the scheduled hearing, Meredith called with news that left them stunned. "Walsh wants to negotiate," she reported, excitement barely contained in her professional tone. "His attorney reached out this morning. They're offering to voluntarily relinquish all parental claims in exchange for a confidentiality agreement and a modest settlement." "Settlement?" Everett repeated, confused. "He wants us to pay him." "No," Meredith clarified. "He's offering to pay you specifically to establish a college fund for Thomas. It's a face-saving measure. He can claim he's being magnanimous while extracting himself from a fight he's realized he might lose." The offer seemed too good to be true, raising immediate suspicion in both Everett and Eliza. But further investigation suggested Walsh's priorities had indeed shifted dramatically. His company was facing financial scrutiny in the wake of his divorce filing, and rumors of impropriety had begun circulating among investors. He needed the custody battle to disappear, and quickly. After careful consideration and extensive consultation with Meredith, they accepted a modified version of the offer: the college fund for Thomas, complete removal of Walsh's name from all legal documents, and a mutual non-disparagement agreement that protected everyone's privacy. "I can't believe it's over," Eliza whispered the night after signing the final paperwork. They sat on their back porch, the summer evening warm around them, Thomas asleep inside after an exhausting day at the park. "Part of me is still waiting for the other shoe to drop." "It's really over," Everett assured her, though he understood her hesitation. After months of constant anxiety, peace felt almost suspicious in its sudden arrival. "Walsh has bigger problems now, and we have everything that matters." As summer transitioned to fall, they gradually emerged from the defensive posture they'd maintained for so long. With the legal threat removed, they could focus on the future they'd been fighting to secure. Everett legally adopted Thomas, a formality that felt profound despite simply confirming what they all knew to be true. They began discussing long-term plans, expanding Everett's workshop business, possibly having another child someday, maybe even marriage when the timing felt right. On a crisp October day, almost exactly a year and a half since Eliza had stumbled half-frozen to Everett's cabin door, they made the drive up to his former mountain home. Peterson had maintained the property as promised, using it occasionally as a ranger outpost, but keeping it essentially as Everett had left it. "Why did you want to come back?" Eliza asked as they approached the familiar clearing. Thomas secured in a carrier on Everett's back, wide-eyed at the wilderness around him. "Closure, maybe," Everett replied, "or just to show Thomas where it all began." Where his life began, really. The cabin stood weathered but solid against the backdrop of pines and distant peaks. Inside, dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight filtering through the windows, illuminating the simple space where their story had started, where Everett had delivered his own son without knowing the truth, where Eliza had fought infection and survived, where 3 lives had intersected through what some might call coincidence and others might name destiny. Thomas squirmed to be let down, eager to explore this new environment. They watched him toddle around the cabin, touching the rough-hewn furniture with curious fingers, babbling happily at his own discoveries. "It's strange," Eliza mused, standing in the spot where she had first awakened after the blizzard. "I was so afraid that night, lost, freezing, in labor. I thought I might die out there. Instead, you found your way here." Everett finished, moving to stand beside her. To me, she turned to face him, her expression softening with emotion. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't? If my car had broken down somewhere else, or if I'd waited out the storm in the last town? Everett considered the question, watching Thomas investigate a shaft of sunlight with fascinated concentration. I used to believe life was just random events, some cruel and some kind. After Sarah died, after losing Emma, it seemed like there couldn't be any greater purpose to suffering like that. And now, Eliza prompted when he paused. Now I think maybe there are patterns we can't always see, threads connecting moments across years, bringing people together when they need each other most. He reached for her hand. I don't know if I believe in fate exactly, but I believe we were meant to find each other again through Thomas. As if hearing his name, their son looked up and beamed at them, his smile so reminiscent of Everett's that Eliza laughed softly. He's the best of both of us. He is, Everett agreed, and he deserves to know the whole story someday. The truth, all of it. How his mother's courage saved them both in a blizzard. How fate or chance led her to the doorstep of the father she didn't know he had. How he brought healing to two people who thought they'd lost their chance at happiness. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, delicate flakes drifting past the windows, not a blizzard this time, but a gentle reminder of nature's cycles, of endings that become beginnings, of storms weathered and peace found in their aftermath. Everett Morgan, once a lone trapper who had fled to the wilderness to escape his ghosts, looked at the family he had never expected to find, a son he hadn't known existed, a woman whose strength had matched his own brokenness, a future bright with possibilities neither had dared to imagine when their paths first crossed. And he knew with absolute certainty that his long journey through grief and isolation had led him exactly where he was meant to be. Home, not to a place, but to them,